get through the didactic portion of this, just talking and kind of having a dialogue about what the narrative summary is and how we use it here before lunchtime. And then when we come back, the afternoon is going to be filled with doing some actual practice around writing a narrative summary in smaller groups, and then talking a lot more about the treatment plan and what's different from the current treatment plan many of you are using. Give you some time as well to have some practice writing new TCP treatment plans. So that's what we've got here on the agenda. And I'm going to jump right in. How many of you, first question that I have, went to grad school at a time and in a place where there was some discussion about, at the end of an assessment, writing some sort of narrative summary, clinical formulation, even if it's your thoughts as a clinician, just sort of summarizing in a paragraph or two what you found during the assessment? Anyone have experience with that early on? A few hands, not the majority of you, but so for some of you this may be a new twist on something that's somewhat familiar to you. And it's certainly not anything radical or earth-shattering, but we think that it's a really great addition to what we're doing currently. And what we've realized is that as we're doing assessments, we're taking the narrative summary process and the process of making a clinical formulation about a case really requires us to analyze assessment data and pick out the most significant details that we've heard over a session or maybe even a few sessions that we're doing assessment with a client, with their family, and all of that involves taking some time to really synthesize what we have into a written form. And I think all of you would say that at some level, as you do an assessment right now, you're doing this in your head. You're listening to your client's story, you're sorting through things in your mind, you're picking out particular details about the story that you're hearing, and you're following up with some additional questions. And that by the time you get done writing an assessment, you have at least in your head some sort of rough idea about the direction you think would be most helpful for your clients. And then often what we do as we move into the treatment plan phase is that we're sort of feeding that back to our clients and saying, this is what seems to be most significant to me. Am I catching everything? Is this a sort of treatment plan now that we're developing that you could sign off on? Do you think that's going to work? As we think about what we've been doing as a system, what we realize is that that's a really important part of the clinical process that we have with our clients and families. And if we get that wrong, if we have some mistaken assumptions about what is significant for our clients, or there was a piece that we didn't quite understand, or our focus is a little off in any way, what we do moving forward with the treatment plan and any sort of interventions that we do are also going to be off base. And what TCP does is recognize the importance of that process and create more room for it and formalize it in a way that we don't, if it's up to us, make any sort of mistakes or lose focus at this point. If we can, to use the gymnastics idea, if we can stick the landing right there. We've been going through all sorts of different tumbles and twists as we hear about the client's story, but if we can stick the landing at the point where we say, I understand your story as much as you've told it to me, and we both agree on the direction that we need to take moving forward, then we're going to be in a great position to help our client make positive changes down the road. So it is going through that mental process and also going back to our clients and making sure that we got it right, double checking with them and making changes if we need to. So it's a collaborative written document of the client and family story related to what brought them in for services. We're going to give you a little bit more structure that will help you write these and include what you think is relevant. But what we find is that it really supports the client's path to wellness, that it demonstrates we understand what their story means to them in the context of them coming in for help, and that it describes the strengths-based approach that we've been taking. It describes some of the most significant cultural aspects that are going to impact treatment, and that it talks about where the client is in their own desires to make changes. It doesn't repeat, it's not going to be a repeat of either the assessment or the treatment plan, but it's going to recap the most significant pieces out of the assessment, and generally at the tail end then point in some directions about what might be helpful in treatment itself as the treatment plan gets developed. One of the most significant pieces for me, as I've worked with Jeannie over at Juvenile Hall and we've consulted with staff on writing narrative summaries, is this idea of a central theme or a hypothesis. That at the end of the day, I want to be able to hear back from my staff, what is the most significant challenge that this client is facing, and what do we think is going to be able to move them forward? And if somebody can't sum up for me in about 30 seconds, based on their narrative summary, what the core theme of treatment is, and what's most significant for treatment moving forward, then I think, okay, what you probably did was pull facts from different places and put it on a document. I'm not sure you've actually done the sort of mindful, reflective kind of practice that we're looking for in the narrative summary. Another piece that we emphasize is that there's no one right way to write a narrative summary. You will not see in here, and we've sort of done trial and error on this. There have been times in the past where we said, the narrative summary has to have a sentence on this and a sentence on that, and then you're going to have 12 sentences here and 3 paragraphs, and that's going to be the narrative summary. That central hypothesis is really important. We've got to be able to get to that point. But again, we're not going to give you a formula that you plug in facts and details and you spit out a perfectly well-written narrative summary. There may be elements that are unique to one narrative summary that are completely left out of another summary. Somebody's work environment and the quality of their relationships with people on the job may be very significant for one client. And another client of the same age, same developmental situation, same diagnosis even, that may be completely left out. They may have a job, but you may make almost no mention of their work environment in a different narrative summary, depending on the unique characteristics of that client. Obviously, culture is something that's got to be woven throughout the narrative summary, as it is with all of our documentation. And we're certainly going to encourage folks, for any of you who haven't read the DSM-4 TR section on cultural formulation and cultural factors in treatment, I think it's worth a read once in your life. Even if you go back and you have to read the DSM-5 cultural section in a year or two down the road, it's still worth it. And it really does provide a good framework, I think, for making considerations about culture. And for me, as I have gotten a little more familiar with it through the process of implementing TCP, it's created a bit of a checklist in my mind about, am I capturing all the different aspects? For me, some of that is culturally bound phenomenon related to mental health, right? Are there actually explanations, are there names in the client's native language that describe this with some sort of significant twist on it that I really need to understand? If this isn't called depression, this isn't called panic attack in my client's native culture, then I really need to understand what it is called and what commonly gets included in that, because that's the frame of mind that my clients are going to be bringing to that. So that is certainly a helpful section. I'm not imagining that people are going to be photocopying it and keeping it at their desk as they're writing a narrative summary. But certainly, as we've been reviewing narrative summaries and giving folks feedback about that, if we're reading a summary that just doesn't have any accounting for the impact of culture in the client's treatment, we're going to point that out and we're going to ask for that to be fleshed out a little bit, because it's, again, so significant in the way that we do treatment.
And just to kind of cap onto that, it doesn't have to be so overtly like the individual's culture is this. It should be woven throughout and kind of pieced throughout. I mean, in the beginning you may see some that outwardly would say, you know, the person identifies with this, But as people get more natural into this process, they'll start understanding that culture is woven throughout a person's life and the impact of that in their life. So we want to kind of make that point for you guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly, again, what we want to avoid is the regurgitation of exact comments that you've made in an assessment, for example. What we don't necessarily need to see is so-and-so is a 33-year-old Cambodian female with blah, 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 and then citing off religion and all of this other sort of stuff. What you may say, as you're describing and introducing the client, is you may say, as a Cambodian female, this is what's important to the client, and you may talk a little bit about that. We certainly want something that's going to give that flavor. And what we find when we have folks who have done a narrative summary really well with their clients and families is that it comes across as very strengths-based. For those of you who have any sort of training in narrative therapy, it's this great way to capture the client's story, perhaps in a way that changes some things for them about how they've thought about themselves and their story. I was reading a work by Bruce Perry just recently, who's done quite a bit of work on childhood trauma and the treatment of that. And what struck me is that as he's working both with traumatized children, but also with their caregivers, that he includes narratives in his written works that really cast the abuser, the person who was neglectful of the child, in a way that doesn't cut them any significant level of slack for the damage that they've done to the child, but is also the sort of story that Dr. Perry could present to that adult in the child's life, and they would say, yeah, that's the story. I didn't do what my child needed to have done. I didn't provide the kind of environment that I needed to provide for my child. Here's a little bit of the story about why I wasn't in a place that I could do that, and this has been the impact on my kid. And it struck me that he was really doing a great narrative summary. So it became very strengths-based. It was written in a way that engaged the whole family and was something that in most cases, not all cases, could be read to a larger cross-section of the client support system, and people would not be put on the defensive, but they would generally find themselves nodding in agreement. That's what it looks like to get that story right. We're literally telling the opening scene of a movie or a dramatic production of some kind. And if we get that opening scene right, everybody says yes, and let's talk about what comes next. I want to keep watching or participating as this unfolds. So it supports their positive development. It provides really a great relationship between the consumer and their family and the staff member that's participating. And it gets people all, I tell my staff, the best way to make sure that we're all on the same page between our clients and providers is to have an actual page. And it's written down, and we can both read from it, and we're on that page. We agree that what's written there is accurate. And that's why in some cases, some of you are going to want to look at, do I need to translate this into another language? Those are some of the things that we've started to talk with QI about, and how do we do that? There may be other times you realize that your client's own language is verbal, really, rather than written, and your client isn't going to be able to engage. Even though you're going to produce a written page, a lot of the discussion that you have with your client is going to be verbal. And you're going to read the story and say, did I get this right? What should I change? And for your own records, you will go back and make the written changes. But that conversation and that work may be very much more in a verbal form. At the end of the day, it has to leave the client and any of the significant support people that you're working with feeling comfortable and confident that you understand who they are and where they're coming from, and that you both are on the same page about how to move forward with treatment. Any questions at this point? We're getting towards the tail end. We'll do another video and then move into some exercises as we move along here. But some of the context of this as we look back historically is that we know over the last 10 years, even 20 years, if we want to go back that far, regulations and government guidelines, different accrediting organizations have increasingly asked for more and more detail in assessments. And what they've done along with that is that they've said, you don't just need to provide more detail, we want it on these points. And they kind of give a checklist about a thorough assessment is covering all of this from A to Z to make sure that you've done your job thoroughly. And if we were to compare the way we did assessments as a profession 15 years ago to the way we do it now, there's quite a bit more detail in a lot of cases. Again, moving in some cases to check all these boxes off. We want to know that you asked all these questions. And what happens then is that there's a lot of data there, but there's not necessarily a coherent story. We start creating that in our mind as we hear about it, but even our county form, the 6-page salmon-colored assessment that someone referenced earlier, I know in some of your agencies it's electronic or it's a different color or whatever else. That 6-page form doesn't lend itself to telling a story. It lends itself to capturing certain data elements and making sure you covered everything. So this is that really critical piece where we get to start telling the story. The assessment isn't the sort of form you can put in front of a client and say, did I get this all right? And be able to move forward directly into treatment planning. So we got to get this right. This is just covering a little bit more detail. It definitely has to have the strengths of the client and their support system in there and consider all of the details that are relevant to them. We'll capture some things, and there's certainly a very strong emphasis on present this to the client, present this to their family as much as that's appropriate in their support network, and then use their feedback in a lot of cases to make some changes and fine-tune that before you move into plan development to make sure that they've got that right.